Well, it is Artificial Intelligence Week on Capitol Hill. It seemed as though every other committee hearing was dealing with the issue of AI. So this is also a subject not a lot of us know a whole lot about. So joining me to talk about it and help break down what it is that we saw on Capitol Hill, specifically with the big tech CEOs in the Senate hearing, or the Senate Summit, I guess is what they were calling it. Chris Carr, he's the CEO of Farotech, which is a digital marketing firm in Philadelphia, and he's an AI thought leader, knows this stuff inside and out. No better guy to talk to about this. Chris, thank you for coming on the DC Debrief. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
It's good to talk to you, buddy. And I know that you've really been working hard to get your hands around this issue for years now. And artificial intelligence, it's here to stay. There's no doubt about it. And it sounds as though the U.S. Senate has come around to that understanding as well, to the point where Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer welcomed, again, I mentioned earlier in the podcast, all of the big tech CEOs to the Senate for this big meeting, a conversation, because he wants to try and understand what role should government play in artificial intelligence. It was called the AI Insights Forum. Can you talk a little bit about some of the key items that stood out for you? None of this was open to the public, but obviously we're getting dribs and drabs of what was discussed after the fact.
Yep. I think it was a moment in history. I think that ideally that we're going to look back and say, hopefully this is kind of the Manhattan Project of our era. That would be looking at it very positively. I'm kind of looking at it with two lenses. I'm optimistic, but I'm also kind of raising an eyebrow as well. These are supposed to be information sessions before they start to talk about regulation. And that's great. But I also kind of think it's kind of like a dog and pony show, because I've been doing AI for nonstop for nearly 3 years, and I don't even feel qualified to learn and talk about it. So like teaching this to 65-year-old lawmakers is very interesting, but I think you have to have these public forums to make it look like, hey, you know what, we weren't just making random decisions based upon our own, basically our own current knowledge of the subject matter. But, if I'm going to learn, am I really going to call 22 different thought leaders in a 4-hour session? Like, probably not the most efficient way to learn something. But it absolutely looks good. Even when the press isn't there, it's sort of, it does all the optics.
And I guess it's just kind of a first step, right? I mean, this is Senator Schumer, I imagine, knows that something needs to be done, should be done, but it was kind of just a feeling out session, I guess. So you can argue certainly that you can have too many cooks in the kitchen, and that might be one of the things that happened, although we don't know the depth to which this topic was discussed. In your mind, based on what you've heard come out of it, what was some of the good and what was some of the bad?
I mean, some of the good is that it's bipartisan, and that's what I hope that it remains. Is that, both sides are kind of need to come together on this, because if this gets political, we're going to lose a lot of the urgency that is desperately needed to make critical regulation. I'm a pro-regulation guy, but I'm also very leery of this situation here, where you're sort of calling the tech companies that are building the product, coming to lawmakers and basically saying, this is how I want you to regulate us. It's pretty interesting, So I think that that's some of the good, and just from an optics standpoint, they said to all the tech giants who was welcome to regulation, and every single one of them raised their hand. So at least, there is some initial discussion that these companies know that they're dealing with something that could easily spiral out of control, if they get it wrong. And that's scary, not only for the companies, but it's also scary for mankind.
We've talked about some of the people who were in attendance, of course, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and Bill Gates and others. But I'm sure there were some folks who were not invited that probably should have been invited. And do you have any sense as to maybe who was not invited to the party who probably should have been?
Well, it's closed door. And so here's one of the number one problems is that I wanted to know who was invited. And I tried to get a list, and they just kept saying the big five, Elon and Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates and things like that. But what I did notice is that there were not a lot of open source guys other than Mark Zuckerberg. And there were not any, what I would call, people that are very transparent about the perils of AI. You have Ahmad Mustafi, and then, you have, you have Jeffrey Hinton, who was the godfather of AI that left Google. And then you have, Mustafa Sullivan, these are people that are tech giants, but they're also very, very transparent about the perils. So it seemed like they cherry picked some of the guys that are going to keep this thing as optimistic as possible, if that makes any sense. Yeah,
it does. And can you talk a little bit more about open source versus closed source? What is the difference between those two?
Well, one of the things that's very funny about all of this is that I get asked about AI regulation a lot, and there's so many just parallels to other arguments that we have that we aren't able to solve. So let's say hypothetically, like the argument I'm thinking of is kind of like the gun argument. So in the gun argument in the Second Amendment is basically we have the rights as citizens to own firearms and basically develop a militia in case the government becomes too powerful. And in theory, if they own all the weaponry, we can't defend ourselves. Well, in this model, if all of the private AI companies, these tech giants, own the AI, and AI is literally rocket fuel for technology, if those companies get too powerful, like in theory, who could stop them? And so OpenAI was designed to be an open source company. And these are companies that use AI technology the same way the big players do, but you don't have the same limitations that the private companies have. And these private companies in the OpenAI, these open source companies, they're very combative in the fact that the open source companies literally have all the technology and give it out to the world for free. And the private AI companies, that's basically how they make their fortune.
So it would seem to me that the OpenAI guys are at a financial disadvantage, that they wouldn't be able to compete, that they wouldn't be able to stay afloat if you have these other companies that are using artificial intelligence to make a profit, and they're selling it to certain groups or certain businesses or certain governments, that there would seem to be a disadvantage there.
Yeah, I mean, there is. But like one of the things that we're talking about with regulation is where are they going to regulate? Are they going to regulate with these private companies that are building the models? Are they going to regulate at the model development level, or just how you apply the AI? If they do it at the model level, and one of the main things they're arguing for is transparency, the open source guys are licking their lips because I'd love to know what data you're using, how you're training it, and things like that, because that's literally the ingredients we need to basically build very similar AI models. And the private companies are like, hey, we want to build it how we want to build it. Let's just regulate on how it's used. And so it gets a little bit scary. Now, one of the things I didn't mention when I talked about open source companies is open source, while it has a lot of the ability to give it away for free, it's also, from an AI security standpoint, bad actors could actually get one of these free models, take all the guardrails off. And that spells a lot of danger for society, because that's when you can get into how do I make anthrax?
Right.
Like
and
that.
I think, and that was one of the questions that Elon Musk got asked by reporters after he left the meeting. And I think a reporter was trying to be somewhat funny about it, but in a serious way, this is something that worries me and worries a lot of people, is how do we prevent AI from doing the Terminator situation, launching the nuclear weapons against us? And obviously that's a very dramatic way of looking at artificial intelligence, but there are some real dangers about AI. And this reporter asked Elon Musk about how do we prevent AI from killing us all? And he gave a very, scientific answer. We're talking probabilities, and the probability is such and that. But the bottom line here is that I think senators and the American people and everybody else wants to make sure that AI doesn't become a weapon against humanity, and that it serves humanity. So I imagine that's a lot of where these regulations and where these laws and a lot of where this conversation needs to be directed.
Yeah. It's funny too, because like I was saying, how a lot of this stuff relates to parallels. And, I just recently watched the Oppenheimer movie, and there's this thing where it says, what is the chances that this thing is just going to basically eviscerate the entire atmosphere? And Oppenheimer's like very, very small, like, less than 1%. And Matt Damon's character is like, I'd like it to be 0.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
If we can get that number down to nothing, that'd be fantastic.
I would like it to be 0. Well, rest assured, with the AI, the genie is out of the bottle. We definitely pressed the button here. So now we have to figure out, how do you get it to 0? But at the same time, how do you not stifle innovation? Because the easy model is the race competition model that China's been in the AI game for as long as we have. They're very hush-hush about what they're doing. And so if you over-regulate this, then you're going to stifle innovation. And if you stifle innovation, you don't want to come in second place on this race. You just don't.
So we're talking a little about some of the negative ramifications of AI. I want to double back on that for a second, but just so that we're not scaring everybody.
Yeah, sure.
What are some of the good things that you're seeing AI is being used for, in ways in which it can be useful, in ways in which it can make our society function better?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's going to revolutionize healthcare for sure. I mean, the AI, these powerful AI tools are able to just basically synthesize and analyze proteins that would take, I don't know, like months and years. They're doing it in seconds. They're transforming the way we communicate. They are creating opportunities in technology that there's going to be a tremendous amount of entrepreneurship. Now, on the other hand, there's also going to be some job replacement, displacement stuff as well. So there's a lot of it's rocket fuel for innovation, but it's also the speed of innovation is the scariest part of this. We've never seen anything grow or basically multiply like this in human history. And so it's a very much fire in a bottle type situation. But, those who play with it understand the power. And when you understand the power, you start to dream big.
Last thing for you here then. So if Congress is going to start getting involved and senators, they start wrapping their minds around this and they start working with these tech companies and they start working with people who are developing AI, what kind of do you get a sense for a kind of a timeline on when we'll start to see some of these regulations put in place and what some of those regulations might look like?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that you're seeing is that Europe is a little bit ahead of the game here. I believe that there's 37 different countries on 6 continents, all with a draft of regulation right now. But Europe, like usual, they were ahead of us on privacy with GDPR and things like that. They will probably have formalized regulations probably by December of 2023. And I believe that we will have it in Q1. The problem here is that, those stories about like lawmakers, they get like an 8,000 page document put on their desk and they're supposed to vote on it the next day.
Yeah.
You're talking about some of the most complex technology questions ever been asked of human history. And so we're dying for the urgency to be addressed, but the complexity of this is just absolutely crazy. And so the main argument that we have to worry about here is what I call, not what I call, but it's when the federal government is basically used to be the watchdog to make sure that the big companies, make it sure that the big companies win and the small companies don't. And so when you rush to regulation, I think that it could easily favor the big companies, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's generally speaking what happens. It's infrequent that the more regulation you get, the better it is for the little guy, and the little guys get eaten up.
Yep.
In a lot of those cases.
Yep.
Well, and this is obviously going to be with us for a really long time, and we're just getting started on this whole thing. And I think as Americans, I'm still trying to understand exactly what it is. You hear about chat GPT. I mean, you hear about, people can make silly pictures, using artificial intelligence. You're worried about, with the election, deep fakes and videos that look like someone is speaking when they actually never said anything like that. I mean, these are kind of the things that I think most Americans think about when they think of AI, but it's a whole other world out there with AI that goes far beyond that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's almost inexplainable how much faster they'll be able to do things. So that when you think about AI, one of the main things that you're talking about is like a neural net. So a neural net, imagine every company in the world, or specifically in America, will have their own AI. And every person in that company, 50% of the keystrokes that you're doing on a computer are teaching your computer, and the computer is teaching the AI. Think about a 200-person company. Every single thing that we're learning is all going into the central database so that your company is getting smarter by every single keystroke. Now multiply that by every company in your city in every state in every country in the world. Companies like ChatGPT are just learning and compounding at rates that you would never even imagine.
It's exciting and scary at the same time. And I think that's the tone and the vibe coming from Congress right now with regard to this issue. And that's why I think you're seeing Senator Schumer and other members of Congress, especially with all these hearings this week, really diving into this issue full bore. And listen, there's nobody better to talk about this with than Chris Carr, CEO of Farotech, based out of Philadelphia, digital marketing firm there. And Chris, if people want to find out more about AI, more about what you're doing, how do they do that?
Mm-hmm. Well, my company, you can go to www.farotech.com or hit me up at info@farotech.com. But here's what we do is we kind of realized very early that AI was basically gonna hit like an asteroid, and a lot of companies are just not prepared for what's coming. And so I offer a free 1-hour course. It's free, not a course, but it's a presentation. I do it over Zoom or I do it in person, and I literally just say, this is where AI is at. This is where it's going, and this is how you can be prepared. This is kind of a free resource that I do for any company, and I'm doing this presentation maybe 15 to 20 times a month.
Chris, it's outstanding information. Thank you so much for helping to make all of this clearer for us. We appreciate you coming on the DC Debrief.
All right. Thanks a lot.